Hey everybody, welcome to the latest installment of MSP Business School. As always, I'm Brian Doyle and I'm your host today. We are going to have a very interesting conversation today, and it's going to be a little bit different than some of the ones that we've had in the past, but it's really a story of, how to overcome. So I'd like to welcome today Craig Stanland to the show. Craig is an author and keynote speaker, and he's going to tell you a story, and we're going to go right into it. He's going to tell you about a catastrophic situation that really turned around and allowed him to kind of find his rock bottom, unfortunately. So with that said, Craig, welcome to the show.
Brian, thank you so much for having me. We've chatted a little bit before this, and I'm looking forward to diving into it. And, I'd love to just kick off with a little bit of background, if you don't mind.
No, please do.
So in 2013, I worked for a gold partner of Cisco Systems. I had worked for the same company for 13 years. I've made my way to the top of the sales organization, number one, number two, number three. And then our biggest competitor, wooed me away with an aggressive pay package that I couldn't ignore. And so I said, yeah, I'll take the job. And I'm 2 weeks into this brand new job. And it was October 1st, 2013 to be exact. And I drove from my home in Connecticut to my new office in New York City. And I take the elevator up 37 floors. And I start setting up my desk for the day like we would all do. I take my laptop out. I put it on the desk. I take my notebook out. I put that on the desk. And then I grab my cell phone. And I notice that there's a missed call and a voicemail. And I thought to myself, that's so weird. Who's calling me at 8:45 on a Tuesday morning? So I did what we'd all do. I put the phone to my ear, and this is what I heard. Mr. Standland, this is Special Agent McTiernan with the FBI. We are at your residence and have a warrant for your arrest. You need to call us and come home immediately, or we will issue a warrant with the federal marshals for your arrest. It was one of the most terrifying moments in my entire life. It was like all the air in the room completely vanished. My heart and stomach fell to the 37 floors that I had just come up. And that was the start of the journey to rock bottom.
You've told me that story in the past, and it's one of those moments that I kind of put myself in your shoes and try to think about how you would feel in that moment. And even going one step further, I didn't realize it was on the first day at a new job. What that feeling must have been just going home, knowing what was waiting for you, too. I can't even imagine, you had about, for those that don't know the distances, New York City back to where Craig lived at that point in time, probably about an hour, right? Via train.
It was about an hour, and it was the longest and shortest hour of my entire life, if that makes sense.
No, interested to hear it because, that is some news, and it's not something any of us, I think, expect to hear on the other end of the line.
Well, here's what's really interesting. When I got that voicemail and my brain was trying to catch up with what I just heard, and I'm picking my heart and stomach off the floor that fell, the 37 floors that just fell down, my heart, that inner voice that we all have, it spoke, and it spoke very crystally clear. It said, I told you so. So I knew something was coming. And then to drive home for that, it was about an hour into just sheer terror. I didn't know what I was driving into. I had no way of anticipating what really was going to be waiting for me. But when I did enter my neighborhood, I go through the gates of our community. I take the right-hand turn down the hill. That's when it came into view. It was like a scene out of a movie. There were unmarked federal cars. There were local police cars. So for anybody who's curious, I was in Connecticut, and all the neighboring towns, not just my own town, all the neighboring towns showed up. It's like everybody was excited to arrest me. There was a SWAT vehicle in my neighborhood and an army of about 20 law enforcement. And as soon as they saw my car, they all pointed and they all put their hands on their weapons. This journey of mine was just one step of paranoia to the next.
Yeah, that's a surreal moment, and certainly one I'm sure you never expected yourself there. But I want to go back to something you just said a moment ago. You knew it was coming, right? So maybe let's dive into that a little bit and, kind of how does one end up in a situation where a movie scene's playing out in their front yard?
It can happen, I think, a lot faster than people will ever realize. So I was a successful account manager for the Cisco Gold partner, but the market for the Cisco products had changed. The housing crisis had a lasting impact on the economy as a whole, but also the reseller community. And the Cisco equipment it was no longer about the value you could bring to the table. It was about who had the lowest price. Yeah. And it was just a race to the bottom of profit margins. And I watched as my commission checks shrank and they got smaller and smaller. Well, I was so used to living this luxurious lifestyle, not because I did enjoy it. I'm not going to sit here and say that I didn't, but because I had, and I still struggle with this to this day, a great sense of inadequacy and unworthiness. It's something that has plagued me ever since I was a little kid. And so I really threw myself into that luxurious lifestyle to make myself feel like I had to be the man I needed to be somebody in this world. And I started, dating somebody who eventually became my wife. And I did the worst thing in any relationship. I put her all the way up here and me all the way down here, and I felt that I had to fill the gap between us with a luxurious lifestyle. So with those shrinking paychecks, my identity, who I thought I needed to be, was under attack. And so I started looking for opportunities to fix my quote unquote problem.
Yeah, I think, it's not uncommon that we all have a little bit of that imposter syndrome coming into life when we're looking at how we measure up against, others, that comparative thing. And I think as we get older, we put that aside a little bit more so. But when we're younger and we're in the thick of it, it can be daunting, right? If you're surrounded by a bunch of people, you in your location in Greenwich, Connecticut, it's safe to say there's very few unsuccessful people, but there's also a lot of people that are just playing with daddy's money too. And that's the other interesting part of it, right? They probably have their own imposter syndrome they're feeling. But, but certainly I can appreciate that, when the checks get smaller, but the costs stay the same, there's a challenge in front of you.
Huge challenge. And I'll push back a little bit. It's not even that the lifestyle stays the same. It becomes very addictive. It's just always a case of more and more and more. And more was never going to be enough because I didn't know that I as a human was enough. And so it was just raising the bar constantly. So shrinking paychecks and a rising bar, terrible combination.
So, maybe we can get into a little bit of, what it was that actually led you to, to finding yourself with the FPI on your front door.
So I had started with this Cisco reseller. I started at the very bottom of the corporate ladder. I was an inside sales account manager, and I was supporting all the or one account manager in particular. And what that enabled me to do as I worked my way up the ladder was to learn all the systems and processes. And so when I felt that my identity was under attack, I knew the ins and outs of Cisco's service contract policy maybe better than anybody. I knew how to get replacement equipment from Cisco like lickety-split. I had developed, because I was making those calls on behalf of our clients. I was calling Cisco's TAC to when a piece of their equipment failed. I started fielding those phone calls. So I started taking notes and seeing that there was, patterns and predictability in dealing with Cisco engineers to get that replacement equipment out. So I just was able to create what I called my perfect paragraph, which took 45-minute call times down to about 5 minutes.
It was amazing in itself.
I just knew how to do it. I knew to use their own lingo against them. I knew to beat them to the punch with any troubleshooting steps. I had access to all the client information so I could supply that to Cisco up front. And so I knew how to get that replacement equipment. And I started thinking with this, pressure that my identity was under attack. I said, okay, I know how to get new equipment from them. But if anybody's familiar with Cisco's TAC, Cisco, when a product is under contract, they will ship you a brand new piece of equipment to replace the faulty piece, but you have to ship the faulty piece of equipment back. And so my brainstorm was like, okay, I can get the new equipment, but how do I close the loop and send them a faulty piece of equipment back if I don't actually have a faulty piece of equipment? And I realized I could buy gear from eBay for less than I can sell the brand new piece of equipment that Cisco was going to send me to a third-party reseller. So it was a very simple arbitrage opportunity, And it took me about 4 to 4.5 months to put all those puzzle pieces together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, simply put, I think if I'm hearing you correctly, I'm calling for an advanced replacement, even though one's not needed. I can replace that with a broken eBay object, which there was plenty of back in those days, and then I can ship back the broken eBay object, but capitalize on the secondary market with the advanced switch that you got. Am I kind of playing through it correctly?
I might actually have to borrow your description and replace mine with it. That was perfectly clear. That was great.
I remember those advanced replacement days, and Craig, there was even times where they said we don't want the asset back. So you could even see there's even another opportunity where you can really capitalize in that, back in the day, and I think that can bring us to kind of the next piece of the conversation. So, you had quite a few pressures hitting you. There was a money pressure. There was this opportunity that sat in front of you, and in one of our prior discussions, you shared with me a little bit of a concept called the fraud triangle. And maybe you want to go into what that is a little bit, because I think people might see a little of themselves at some point in time. Not saying, listener, any of you have gone out and replicated, what Craig found himself in, but you may have found a time where you were thinking this way, and I'd love you to kind of go into what that's all about.
So the fraud triangle, I wish I remembered who developed it. It was two individuals. They either were professors or fraud examiners. And the fraud triangle has three distinct points. It is perceived need, opportunity, and rationalization. And if you look at any kind of white-collar crime, or a lot of crime in general, you will be able to map your identity to those 3 points. And I love the fraud triangle. I think it's such an interesting tool. But to your point of what you just said, I actually think it should be called the human experience triangle. Because if we really look at all of our choices that we make, they may not be illegal or slightly, illegal. I think texting while driving is a great example. That is against the law. But you have a need. Your phone dings and you don't want to, leave the message hanging. You feel it bang on you and you're like, I got to reply to it. You have an opportunity. Your phone is right there. And then you rationalize. It's no big deal. Everybody's doing it. The guy in the next lane is doing it right now. So I really think it's a human experience triangle. But it's that rationalization where we lie to ourselves. When we know that we're doing something wrong, we rationalize it. And I actually say this in one of my keynotes. Rationalization is an illogical thought disguised as logic to make our illogical actions seem logical.
So with that being said, you've given us kind of your perceived need in your story. We know what the opportunity is. How are you rationalizing it for yourself at that point in time?
Great question. And it was as simple as this. Cisco sending me a brand new piece of equipment, I'm sending them one back. We're even Steven. I don't see what the big deal is. That was literally the rationalization. However, I was lying because there was no need to have a replacement. I was using aliases. I was using fake company names. All of it was a complete fabrication. So even though, yes, I was completing the loop, it was still a trash rationalization. And I'll take it a step further. I had expanded this fraud to such a degree that when I was arrested on that October 1st, and I'm handcuffed in the back of an FBI car, I didn't invoke my right to silence immediately because I knew that I was guilty. And so they were asking me questions. And they asked who else was involved. And I said, nobody, just me. And they use language, I don't want to curse on your podcast, but they use language that everybody on here, you can insert your own salty language. You're going to be pretty close to what the agent said. And as I had to convince him it was just me. And he goes, we think there was a team of 30 people behind this. And that's like to give you an idea of how much I scaled it.
Yeah.
To make this even more profitable, because I had scaled it to such a degree, I had multiple shipping locations and so many balls up in the air. I started acquiring third-party equipment from eBay to send back to Cisco. So I was sending them knockoff gear without a Cisco serial number, without a Cisco brand. So that rationalization, it just shows how wrong and trashy it really was.
Also shows that when you're in that moment and you're finding yourself kind of getting away with it, you can also get a little I'm going to use an old term, big for your britches, right? Because when you start sending, basically gear that doesn't align, you're almost opening up the door and saying to them, find me.
It was, yes, I love that you brought that up because there's something, the first time I hit the submit button to open up a TAC case, I knew what I was doing was wrong. My heart told me, it said, stop, don't do this. This is not the way for you. And I rationalized my way around it. And then I hit submit. A check shows up. I ship the equipment to the third party. I ship the eBay piece back to Cisco. Everything works out wonderfully. I deposit a check in my bank account. Oh, look at that. What if I did it again? What if I did it again? What if I did it a total of 600 times over the course of 10 and a half months? You get a hubris to you. You become unstoppable. And when you think that you're unstoppable, you're not thinking clearly. You're not making good decisions. You're making decisions from an elevated emotion, which is whether we are really happy or really in a bad place. I believe to make good decisions, we have to be at discernment. We have to be at neutral.
And, one of the things that you see time and time again is once somebody crosses over the line, there's no going back. So, so it becomes a compound problem usually as well. It comes in a variety of ways. Addiction's a great example of it, and things like that where, once you do something that you said you would never do in your life, it becomes easy to do it again and again and again.
It is, I actually call that a rationalization cascade. Once you buy into the first rationalization, it becomes easier the next time and the next time and the next time until it no longer feels weird or a violation of our inner voice. It just feels okay. It feels normal.
It's a pretty wild story. And when I start thinking about just the man hours you put into it too, because returning 600 items, I don't care how well you've figured out the TAC in that component, us all being IT guys, probably listening to this call, we've all made that call somewhere along the way. That's a full-time job in 10 months to have transacted that much.
It was, and I was still working my other job.
Yeah, having to keep your numbers up, right? Or you're not in the office.
Trying to keep the numbers up. Although I was starting to check out, if I'm being quite honest.
Yeah.
I think I knew I was, out the door. I didn't honestly like the new management that came in. They were not so subtly pushing the old timers out. I was only 39, 40 at the time, but I had been with the company 13 years, so I was an old timer, and they wanted to bring in college young guns to, replace all of us. So I kind of checked out, but it was, can I give you an example of what it felt like for that 10 and a half?
Yeah, please do.
So, the scene in Goodfellas, great movie. The end of the movie when Ray Liotta is just coked out of his mind. I've never done coke, not my thing. But he is coked out of his mind. The babysitter forgot her lucky hat to make her airport run. The brother has to stir the sauce. Ray Liotta is driving around town and he's looking up for the helicopters and he's sweating bullets and he is just an absolute mess. I love that movie. I have a very hard time watching that scene because it brings me back to the same exact energy that I had trying to keep this fraud going for a period of 10 and a half months. The frenetic energy of that just stabs at the center of me that was committing fraud.
Yeah, I mean, there's not many of us that have ever had to look over our shoulder on a daily basis, right? And you can feel the stress in that scene. I'm very familiar with. It's definitely one where you're waiting for the shoe to drop. You just don't know when it's going to happen, right?
It is, and with committing a fraud of this size and scope, it was 20 shoes, if not more. It was just, there were so many different shoes that could drop at any given moment. And even through all of that, I ignored all the red flags that were blatantly in front of me. You just move forward with blinders on, and it's honestly a terrible way to live.
So, now all this is hit, and now we're into the aftermath, right? All that frenetic energy, as you say, is kind of past. You've been caught. What happens next?
Next, I enter really one of the most terrifying periods of my life because I was arrested. I knew that it caught up with me, but I didn't know what the outcome was going to be. And it was, at first when I told my attorney, I said, I think I'd like to fight it. And he said, you're an idiot. basically, if you try to fight this, you're guilty, you're going to prison, let's work with them.
Yeah.
I accepted that, and then I had to start thinking about actually going to prison and what that would mean. I was married at the time. I knew that was going to totally fracture my marriage because I also lied to her over and over again about what I was doing. I broke that secret foundation of any relationship, which is trust, totally smashed that to pieces. I didn't know that there were different levels of prisons. I didn't know that there was such a thing as a white-collar prison where I would be with other white-collar offenders and nonviolent drug offenders. I thought I was going to the prisons we see on TV.
Yeah.
And, for the audience, I'm at the time of the arrest, and still to this day, I haven't grown any taller. I'm 52. That time has passed. But I'm 5'4", and at the time I was 140 pounds. I'm not a large individual. So I spent so many months thinking that I was going to get raped and beaten every single day. And it was, I drank myself into oblivion and just trying to, pull whatever I could of life somewhat together as this all unfolded.
And when you shared that story with me the first time we talked, when you think about the loss that comes with it, it is, you've used the word cascade. I mean, it just becomes like a waterfall, right? It starts with job, wife, freedom. There's a lot of steps that come out of an event like yours, but there's always light at the end of the tunnel, and that's really what kind of brought us together to have our first conversation. It's really the reinvention, right? So for the listeners, Craig did his time, came out on the other side. And, now we can really get into the story because, look, all of us have made a mistake. And again, I also want to preface, I keep using the word mistake, and Craig does not like that. He owns it a lot differently. I will call it a mistake. But, we've all had a moment where we could be driven to either side of the edge. And I think it's depending on how hard the pressures are pushing you. Some fall on one side, some fall on the other side of the equation. But now you've done it. You've done your time. You come out. And that's got to be almost as scary as going in.
So when I was in prison, this might sound strange to you and the listeners, I had a 24-month sentence, right? So, I knew that there was an end date. However, you get some time off for good time, and you can also leave prison to go to a halfway house. And I really wanted to go to the halfway house because you can get a job, you can go to the pharmacy, you can leave the halfway house and kind of integrate back into society. This is the weird part. You have no idea when you're going to do that. There's no definitive date. It all of a sudden pops up where Standland, pack your things, you're leaving in 2 days. Yep. I mean, it's so up in the air. And all of a sudden I found out that I was going to be going to the halfway house. And I was like, this thing that I've been waiting for so long, it's a reality. And it scared the heck out of me. And I talked to one of my mentors in prison, and I said, Ed, I'm leaving in 2 days. And he said, how you feeling? And I said, honestly, I have no job. I'm getting divorced. I have no money. I don't have a home to go to outside of the halfway house. Who's going to hire me? Who's going to date me? I'm just listing all of these things that I was panicking about. And Ed put his arm around me and he looked at me and he said, Craig, you have a blank canvas. You can paint any picture you want. And that was it's the title of my book. If we're on video, you can see up there. It became the title of my book. So all of my fears had transformed into this new opportunity. And that is when things really started taking off for me. It was a shift of perspective.
And I find it tremendously impressive to see that somebody can come out of that situation with nothing in front of them and have that, internal fortitude to go make a go of it, right? And sometimes it just does take a kind word like that, right, to make something different. There's an old saying, smile at everybody you pass by because you don't know who's having a bad day, right? And we talked about concepts which we'll get more into in a moment, but it's all about reaching one.
It's just about reaching one person. And I'm going to jump into that because I started...
Please.
Before I was actually released from prison, I started writing my book when I was incarcerated before the halfway house. And I was using those black and white composition notebooks, remember from high school. I was the kid who filled in the white with the black when I was bored in class. But I was writing the book, and I'm writing about getting arrested. I'm writing about getting divorced, writing about being financially ruined. I was writing about the suicide ideation I experienced when I was in prison from hitting rock bottom.
Yeah.
All these things that were so fresh and so new and so raw that it was very painful to try to capture those words. And that little gremlin we all have on our shoulder that when we start doing something out of our comfort zone just starts whispering in our ear and telling us how we can't do it and how we're going to fail. Well, my little gremlin was sitting there going, what are you doing? You don't know how to write a book. It's going to suck. Nobody's going to read it. You don't know how to get a literary agent. You don't know how to get it published. You have no idea what the hell you're doing. Why are you doing this? You're already in prison. Why are you torturing yourself this way? And I threw my pen in disgust and I said, why am I doing this? And my heart, the one that's told me, stop, don't do this. This is not the way for you. The heart that said, I told you so when I got the voicemail from the FBI. It spoke so crystally clear that I flipped to a blank page and I wrote the answer down. It said, you're doing this to help one person. And that has been my mission ever since prison, is to just reach one person. So when you talk about fortitude and we talk about resilience, starting from scratch is an utterly terrifying thing to do. And if it's not only starting from scratch, but it's if we want to do anything outside of our comfort zone, we want to pursue a dream, we want to write a book, we want to start woodworking, whatever it may be, it's terrifying. However, when we do it for someone else, we're not carrying the burden for ourselves. Yep. We're carrying it for someone else. And when we carry it for someone else, we are willing to carry that burden and we'll carry it as far as we have to.
Yeah, I mean, I agree so much with that statement. I look at many of the things I've done in my life and the reasons I've done them have very rarely been for me directly, but to support those that I love or need support around me, right? And, you and I have talked a little bit about identity crisis and finding your way. And, we're both of an age now where you do kind of go from chasing the dragon to what's the legacy I'm going to leave, or what is the meaning of it all, right? And you can struggle with that identity. And one of the things I find is because I've put other folks first, I almost don't think of myself in the equation, right? And do things for others. It's wild that when you sit back, you go, okay, what am I?
It's one of the biggest challenges I think that we face in midlife is that for the first half of our lives, I love that, chasing the dragon. Yeah. We chase the status, the lifestyle, the career, all the things that we think we're supposed to. I call it the hand-me-down blueprint of success. Yep. Go to a good school, get a good job, make a lot of money, have the lifestyle that shows that you have a good job. And then at midlife, we realize that something is a little bit off, something is askew. And the way I look at it is we built a life off of a hand-me-down blueprint. So that's why we don't feel comfortable in it, because it's not authentic. And you used a key word in there, meaning. Yep. I think that we all, as human beings, have an intrinsic desire to have meaningful lives. Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning calls it a will to meaning. And I think that is something that's in all of us. And we're not going to get that from the hand-me-down blueprint, but our identity is attached to that. So we have to start asking, who the heck am I? And building from there.
Yeah, and you can find that it takes you in different directions, right? I've spent most of my career running a business, doing that, and this podcast became a labor of love for me because I just wanted to give back to the community that had been good to me for a number of years, right? And help me and my family live a life. But do I consider myself a podcaster? Probably not. Do I consider myself an executive, even though I still run a software company? Maybe not, because I really think there's more to it than just the title that you bring and the things that you do to really define who you are.
There is, and we chatted a little bit about this before we started recording, and I think it's actually important to stand in the power of the title while simultaneously, I love that you added, there is more to it. It's not just the title. There is a lot more to it. But I'll give an example from my own life. It took me just under 6 years from the first word written to publishing Blank Canvas. And I struggled with, even after it was published, I struggled with calling myself a writer. Who am I? Back to that imposter syndrome we were talking about. Who am I to call myself a writer? And I had to give myself permission to call myself a writer. And it felt really good to stand in the power of that. But here's the part I want to dovetail on what you said about there's more to it. I can call myself a writer, but what I think is important, and when it comes to this transformation of identity, we are not the outcome, we are not the title. We're the person who created the outcome or that title. That's who we are. We're not the outcome, we're the effort. And that's a really important delineation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a huge delineation because everything that's worth something, you have to put effort into, right? Whether your bag is business, whether your bag is your family, whether your bag is a sport, if you really want to get the most that you can out of it with the talent that you have, because, that plays into it as well. You got to put forth the effort, right? And, one of the things that I've told you I wrestle with is kind of this concept as I'm building a bootstrap company, even though I've led other companies. It's still at a point where I'm like, CEO is kind of an overreaching title for it because really I'm a founder trying to make it go. But you expressed, look at that a little bit differently and think about leaning into that title because the reality is without somebody steering the boat, without somebody looking at the big picture, the macro dynamics that are going to it, there's no chance that this will get to the next shore, right? And that's part of the driving force in it.
And I think
yet, it's a very small part of my identity.
That's the thing. It's just a small part. It is not you in your entirety. And I think that it will also, standing in CEO, you might start making different decisions.
Yep.
You might when you're like, okay. So it makes me think of something that's been really very helpful for me in my reinvention after prison. And this has been a decade plus to get to what I'm about to say. I have a single statement that encapsulates what I want my business to be. And I actually keep it to myself. So I'm sorry to the listeners, but it's very personal. But the point being, when we start transforming our identities, to capture in one single sentence what it is that you want to create, then from this single sentence, I would ask when I'm faced with a situation, what would he do? And I mean the person who's already accomplished everything that I want to accomplish. What would he do in this situation? And if I'm journaling it, I'll write he in all caps, just to give it the weight that it deserves. It becomes a North Star. So in your terms, like CEO, what would he do right now? Might be a little bit different than a co-founder trying to make it work.
Yep.
As a CEO, you might say, I'm going to make that phone call, I'm going to do X, and then I'm going to follow up with Y. It becomes very definitive.
Yep, and those steps are absolutely things that you put into the path to do it. But I like that concept of really, it's almost like the future you, right? And
Yep.
you got to get to that rung, and then when you get to that rung, it's time to think about the next rung, right? And I think at our age, you hear all the stuff about vision boards and things like that, but the reality is most of us are not chasing the material at midlife. You're chasing something bigger, whatever, and I believe it to be bigger because you're really chasing how am I going to make an impact and what's going to feel good for me, right? And that's really what it comes down to. And in that process, you're hopefully doing right for those that are around you. I could see your struggle with the becoming a writer or a speaker because I'm sure just, a couple of years before that when this was all going down, that was not even something that was in the back of your mind as a future for you.
It was actually a dream of mine. It was a dream that I put on the back burner, and it was still imposter. I said, who am I to write? I have nothing to write about. I don't know how to write, but I loved writing ever since I was a little kid. But you don't write. You get a good job, and you work for a corporation.
Hand-me-down blueprint, right?
Yeah, exactly. Hand-me-down blueprint. So I love that you just brought that up.
Because, it is a reinvention, and I'm sure it didn't, take off on day one either. I'm sure there was a lot of, pushing the needle in small wins. But I think, foundationally, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it had to feel good that you were chasing after something and you saw a path after coming out of some of the darkest moments that anybody can experience.
And I love, so, you know what's been interesting for me, and very powerful for me, are four very simple words that will kind of push back on what you just said. I realized that spent the first half of my life chasing. I was on what I call the golden treadmill, expecting one day to catch the horizon. If you think about that, it's never going to happen. So all of a sudden I had in my reinvention, just like one of those shower moments of crystal clear clarity, where my brain just said to me and said, and this speaks to not chasing the material, four simple words: stop chasing, start creating. And that has been the axis of my reinvention, is connecting with the writer, is connecting with the speaker, being creative and having an impact. And if I can, I'd love to just share kind of the foundation of that. I call it my 3 C's of reinvention.
Please do.
They are, and I didn't realize I was doing this in my decade plus of reinvention. It was only as I'm working on my second book where I saw that there were 3 definitive steps, and they were connect, create, and contribute.
Yeah.
And by connect, I mean connect with ourselves. When you said earlier, who am I? At midlife, who am I? Connect with that version of yourself. From there, start creating, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a book, whether it is woodworking. And then from there, the big one that I believe delivers everything that we want in the second half of our life is that purpose, meaning, and fulfillment. We contribute. We serve something more significant than ourselves.
So to that end, Craig, now you're out there, you're out speaking, you are an author. How are you approaching that? Is most of the conversation about the story that you're sharing here today, or do you have kind of different approaches for different audiences?
Different approaches for different audiences. I have 2 very clear tracks that happen to be interwoven, so it's really fun for me as a speaker. But one of them is the fraud route, and it is really an inside look at somebody who committed fraud so that organizations can identify that insider threat. They can identify the red flags and the behavioral changes and the things that your gut tells you something's going on, but you don't always mention because you're like, maybe John is just going through something.
Yeah.
But go ahead. You wanted to...
No, I was going to say, here in the world of cyber that we deal with, everything's about the human firewall, right? And we talk about that, most of the breaches that occur because a human made a mistake, clicked on a link, clicked on that. But really, you're talking, what you're talking about dovetails so perfectly into it because it's really about the human factor too. Stress, condition can also pose a threat to an organization. And it's very tough to understand the people that are working with you, what's really ticking inside, right? Because we all have our work persona and put up the walls that we can, and it can be tough to tell that. How many times has somebody gotten into trouble? I'm sure, Craig, there's a lot of people that were around you that said, he was a nice guy, I can't believe that happened.
All the time. I can't believe Craig did that. And to that end, actually a line from my fraud keynote is, your internal controls are only as strong as the stories people tell themselves.
Yeah.
And
it's so true.
It's so true because when it comes to fraud, we have access to so much data. We have artificial intelligence. We can do incredible things with all of that. But data does not commit fraud. A human being having a human experience commits fraud. So that's one of the avenues that I speak about, which I really love. And then the second is reinvention. The second half of our conversation is reinvention, living lives with purpose, meaning, and fulfillment, which to me, when we really stop chasing, start creating, and embrace the 3 C's, we unleash our infinite potential. And we can do that within the confines of our existing life. We don't have to give everything up. We don't have to wait for life to change. We can do it within our existing lives. And when we unleash our infinite potential, it's a rising tide that lifts all boats.
And when you really look at it, recovering from rock bottom really just means you might have to live a little bit different life than what you were doing before, but it might actually be a greater life, right? When you look at the things that you were facing coming out of prison, I'm sure there was still a darkness on day 1, day 2, day 10, where you don't know where this is all going to lead to. But if you continue to aspire to do better, be better, and find a way to inspire others through a story where you know, the one thing I want to say, listeners, in all my conversations with Craig, never once did he not own what he did. And, you know, I said earlier, the fact he doesn't like it when I called a mistake, because he knew what he was doing. It was a conscious event. You know, I think that's a big part of it too, because you've got to resolve that in yourself, I think, to move forward as well, and to be able to carry the ball and the torch to the next, you know, the next goal line.
I appreciate it when people say, when I have Q&A at the end of one of my keynotes, and somebody will say, you know, oh, you made a mistake. Don't you think 2 years was too much time? I will correct every single person from the stage gently. I did not make a mistake. I made a choice. There's a huge difference. Recently, while making my scrambled eggs in the morning, I reached into the cabinet for the pepper and I shook it on the eggs as they were cooking, and it was Italian seasoning, which is not good on eggs. That's a mistake. That is a mistake. It has no energy behind it. It has no intention behind it. A choice has a very clear intention, and there's a huge difference. And when it comes to looking for meaning in the second half of our lives, looking to reinvent, that is a conscious choice that we have to make. We don't accidentally stumble into an extraordinary life. We have to choose that. And when we choose, and when I stopped saying it was a mistake and started accepting full responsibility, I gave myself freedom. And from there, when we accept responsibilities for our lives, we accept responsibility for what it is that we do next.
And, you know, as any marathon runner will tell you, it's not about the journey, it's about how you finish, right? And if you finish, that's really the accomplishment. And I think you're taking the steps to reinvent, you know, get to that finish that you're looking for, and charting a different course than the one you were chasing before. Well, Craig, we have gone fairly long with this episode, but I find, you know, your story to be very interesting, and I think helpful for those. That fraud triangle is one I want listener you keep in your mind. Any one of us can connect those three sides on any given day within our lives. You know, rock bottom doesn't come equally for all, but we've all had a moment that's low. And I think it's, you know, where do you go when you connect all three of those dots? Can you control it, or will you make the choice, the intention that drives you in a different direction? Craig, I don't know if you have any closing thoughts. You know, I will say, if you want to engage with Craig, have him come speak to your groups, you know, come in and keynote, especially here in the tech industry where, you know, fraud is something that we talk about on the daily. I think, you know, his LinkedIn URL will be in the show notes, and for those that are watching, it'll be up on the screen as well. You know, get in touch with him and go from there. But Craig, anything you would like to share before we close today?
I would like to actually just share something that I think aligns with what we were talking about with identity. And this has been a statement that came to me while I was journaling that has truly just helped me through this entire journey. And it is, our past cannot define us without our consent. And that's what I want to leave people with.
It's an interesting approach, or an interesting statement, because you're right. If you accept the past, that's how you move on, right? And you can't be your past. You can't be you without your past, but it doesn't have to define your future.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Well, Craig, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate you taking the time, and obviously being as open and vulnerable as you can be with this kind of story. And, you know, kudos to you to finding some light on the other side after paying back your time.
Thank you, Brian, for having me on, and also having this platform, because, you know, what you said earlier is you want to give back to the industry that helped you out so much. Yep. And that's amazing. So thank you for giving all of us, the guests you've had on, the platform to do so.
Doesn't always have to be about how to improve your company, folks. It's about improving you too, right? Because they are all one and the same in many cases. And, you know, Craig's story obviously resonated with me because it had that tech component to it in the front, but really it's a much bigger conversation. It's a much bigger opportunity if you really look at what you can do, you know, as you move forward. You don't have to reinvent yourself because you did something, you know, illegal in the past. You can reinvent yourself just because you're not happy with your station, and really kind of go to the next step. So, Craig, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Brian.
All right. We'll see you again next week, listener. I hope you enjoyed this one, and we'll talk soon.